Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History, as we look today at a political movement that developed in the West in the late 1800s in response to the many problems faced by people there. Because while the West was rapidly settled in the mid and late 1800s, there were problems. Just as excessive crop production in the South drove down the value of cotton, keeping sharecroppers and tenant farmers in debt, the ever-growing wheat crops in the West also meant that each given shipment of wheat, and so each individual farmer's income, was becoming less valuable. And food prices were falling in the late 1880s, early 1890s. And in the South, cotton prices were falling too, again due, in some cases, to overproduction. In some cases, though, due to a pest, the Boll Weevil, which in the late 1800s began destroying cotton crops in parts of the South. So some places faced falling costs from overproduction, others underproduction, as the Boll Weevil ate the cotton fibers developing in the boll. And in many parts of the country, but especially the West, there was, in the late 1800s, a series of droughts and blizzards. Of course, the Great Die-Up of the late 1880s destroyed many of the ranches out west. There were locusts, essentially grasshoppers, that came in swarms that could darken the sky and eat everything growing on a farm in a matter of minutes. There were floods along the Mississippi River and many of the other major rivers of the Midwest and the West. And farmers had other problems too. The high tariffs of the late 1800s, which protected American manufacturers and possibly helped keep up the wages of factory workers. At least that's what they were told. Probably correctly in the mid-1800s, maybe not by the late 1800s. Certainly didn't do much for farmers. Keeping manufactured goods expensive, but otherwise not benefiting farmers much. Indeed, farm equipment was expensive. More and better farm equipment was allowing farms to be more productive, but it meant you had to buy the latest equipment to keep up, and that was expensive. Furthermore, the U.S. began experiencing pretty significant deflation after the Civil War. The government stopped printing paper money not long after the Civil War ended, that making it harder to get cash. Likewise, after the Panic of 1873, the U.S. government switched to a gold standard. And every dollar had to be made of or backed by gold, which also limited the money supply, again, creating deflation, which hurt people in debt, and most farmers were debtors. Also, no longer minting silver into coins, at least not into dollars, hurt someone else. And who else really suffered when the government quit buying all the silver you would bring to it? Yeah, the miners. Silver miners suffered. The mine owners, and of course the mine workers too, who began to lose their jobs. The gold standard was very unpopular with many farmers and also many miners. Although it did make money's value more stable, which was popular among bankers. If you had money, deflation was maybe not a bad thing. If you were in debt, it was real problematic. As we've already mentioned, to buy the new farm equipment and fertilizers and seeds and other supplies, many farmers did go deep into debt, borrowing money from Eastern banks at rates sometimes as high as 40%. A rate today almost unbelievable unless you actually go to a loan shark or a title loan company. If you were to buy a house today, we have historically low interest rates. You might be paying less than 3% interest on a home loan today. A 40% interest rate can make your debt pretty much impossible to pay off as the interest compounds indefinitely. And of course, all that interest was going mostly to big banks in the East, or at least so farmers felt. And, of course, there were two major panics, two financial crises in the late 1700s, the Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893, causing many banks to fail and call in their loans, which ruined many farmers who couldn't pay off their loans all at once. Indeed, some people described the entire period from the mid-1870s to the mid-1890s as a long depression, in a period of persistent economic troubles in America, never as bad at its worst point as the Great Depression of the 1930s, but longer lasting. Farmers also felt cheated by the railroad owners who shipped their produce, and the operators of the grain elevators and warehouses where they stored it, and even by the urban companies who bought their products at the end. So some farmers, again, wanted paper money to be printed, to create inflation, to make it easier to pay off their debts. Although, even many debtors thought that might be going a bit far, but did want to return to minting silver money, an idea also very popular with mine owners, who kept discovering more silver, but now couldn't sell that much of it. Then it was felt by many people in debt that coining silver again would create a moderate, manageable amount of inflation, but not be as crazy as printing paper money. And so farmers began to protest and ask the government to help them out, although it had always been felt, and up to this point, that the government had no business helping individuals. For the government to help individuals would put people in a state of dependence on the government. And America is all about being independent. If people depend on the government, it'll destroy the need for a work ethic. Or that was the traditional thought. But as problems got worse, farmers in the South and West began to feel the government did need to step in and actively assist them. And he became politically active to try to get this. In 1867, Oliver Kelley from Minnesota helped to organize what is officially known as the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, but typically just known as the Grange or the Grangers. And this was partly a social club. Farmers lived pretty isolated lives, just let them get together for picnics and or potlucks and sing-alongs, once a month or so. It was partly a self-improvement society, as they would bring in people to lecture about the latest agricultural science advancements from universities or corporations or other things, for farmers to educate themselves in a society where education was increasingly popular. But they also worked sort of like a union, so that farmers together could put pressure on companies to give them better deals, put pressure on politicians to help out farmers. Now, at first, like any good 19th century society, they were a secret society with passwords and rituals, because that's just fun. But eventually they became pretty open, and were open to both men and women. While men and women might do different work on the farm, they both work awfully hard. And the Grangers tried to help themselves in various ways. They tried to create co-operatives in companies owned by their members. They tried to have cooperatives to build their own farm equipment, and these were not very successful. They did also open cooperatives to run flour mills and cotton gins and other processing plants, and some of those were successful. In some cases, they opened stores to be able to buy stuff at wholesale prices and then sell it at a relatively low price to their members. So some of these cooperatives were successful. They also got involved in politics. And the grain belt of the upper Mississippi Valley, they got a series of Granger Laws passed. And laws passed kind of in the northern Midwest to try to help farmers, primarily to regulate railroads, warehouses, and grain elevators, although they went after banks a bit too. But many of these laws were struck down, thanks largely to a Supreme Court decision in 1886, In the case of Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railway Company versus Illinois, which is a lot to say, so we usually call it the Wabash case. And the complaint of the Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railway Company was, of course, that Illinois had passed laws regulating the railroads, which they said hurt them, and which they argued before the Supreme Court was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court agreed, said Illinois could not regulate this railroad in this way. And this is because, if you look at the map, while the railroad was in Illinois, it was also in many other states. And who alone can regulate commerce crossing state lines?
Oh, the government as a whole, like the U.S.?
The U.S. government, which part in particular? Congress. Only Congress can regulate interstate commerce. And so the Supreme Court said no state could create a law regulating a company that crossed state lines. And so this struck down the particular law the railroad company was complaining about and was the basis of overturning many other Granger laws. But Congress did respond the next year to the complaints against the railroads by passing the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887. This act outlawed pooling or price fixing. It outlawed rebates where a railroad would give a partial refund to a favored customer, which of course is unfair to their other customers. It required railroads to publish their prices openly, again making it harder to treat some customers better than others. To enforce these rules, it created the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was to oversee and enforce all the rules created by the Interstate Commerce Act. Except, while on paper this sounds pretty good as a basis for regulating the railroads, in fact, at least in the late 1800s, the Interstate Commerce Commission very rarely made much effort to actually enforce the rules. In fact, some railroads came to see the Interstate Commerce Commission as a good thing because it seemed to satisfy the public demands for reform without actually requiring the railroads to change very much, at least for now. Indeed, there were more demands for reform. So that 3 years later, in 1890, the Sherman Anti-Trust Act was passed. In theory, at least, putting many more limits on railroad cartels and various monopolies. Although, once again, in the late 1800s, it was very rarely used. In fact, the biggest use of the Sherman Anti-Trust Act in the 1890s was not against any business, but rather against the American Railways Union following the Pullman Strike, the U.S. government arguing that the American Railway Union had an illegal monopoly on the supply of railroad workers. But while the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Anti-Trust Act turned out to be pretty weak in the 1890s, in the 20th century and the 21st century, they have been the basis of other antitrust laws and in their own right, been used against some big businesses. Okay. Again, the Pullman Strike was one of the few cases the Sherman Anti-Trust Act came out, again accusing the union of being a monopoly. Now, the government had also responded in part to the demands for free silver, as printing or minting silver freely was known. Back in 1878, Congress had passed the Bland-Allison Act, which required the U.S. government to purchase and mint a limited amount of silver. But farmers and miners wanted more, again, ideally unlimited or free silver. And in 1890, Congress listened some and passed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Congressman Sherman, brother to General Sherman, being a pretty busy guy in the late 1800s in the Senate. Sherman Silver Purchase Act, again, agreed to purchase even more silver to please Western miners and indebted farmers, although still not in unlimited quantities. And there was kind of a catch. There was a deal that in exchange for the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, Western miners would support an even higher tariff. So in 1890, Congress also passed the McKinley Tariff, sponsored by a congressman from Ohio who would later be U.S. President. McKinley Tariff is one of the 3 highest tariffs in American history, possibly the highest. The average tax rate was 48.4% on taxed imports. And so while miners did benefit from the increased purchase of silver, farmers actually suffered because rising prices on imports more than overcame what inflation was created by the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. As you may have noticed, a whole lot of stuff just happened in 1890. Congress was pretty active that year. The Congress meeting from 1889 to 1891 was so active in so many ways, it was known as the $1 Billion Congress. 1890 being the first year in which the U.S. government budgeted $1 billion for its expenses, at a time when $1 billion was a lot of money. Very little of that money, though, seemed to actually benefit the farmers who were so unhappy. And so others began organizing too. The Grangers were mostly in the Midwest. In other places, mostly the South, farmers began to form farmers' alliances. And principally in the South, again, like the Grangers, partly a social club. There's a songbook of the Farmers' Alliance, partly a self-improvement society. Here we see a notice for a lecture on improved farming methods, partly a political pressure group as well, hoping to work together to push the government to do more for farmers. And something that made the Farmers' Alliance very interesting in the South is that it had both white and black members. Now, sometimes a given county would have 2 Farmers' Alliances, a white one and a black one, but they worked together. And many counties, white and black farmers were in the same Farmers' Alliance outright, feeling they had more in common as poor farmers than they had separating them based on race. And this really scared the political leaders of the South, who were used to keeping poor white and poor black farmers separate, so they didn't unite against the more powerful politicians. Eventually, various farmers' alliances and the Grangers became more and more radical, demanding more and more reform as anger against the banks and the trust grew. Western politicians began to take up the cause of farmers. Even some women, particularly those who'd been involved in the temperance movement and already had experience pushing for reform, became involved in the farming movement too. The most famous by far of these was Mary Lease, who was a very popular public speaker. In 1890 alone, she made 160 speeches, supposedly telling farmers to raise less corn and more hell. In 1891, the farmers' alliances, along with some leaders of the Knights of Labor and the Grangers and Western silver miners, joined together in 1891 to found the People's Party, in bringing together many different groups, miners, farmers, and factory workers, or at least trying to. And so it did draw voters from the North and the South and the West. Both Republicans and Democrats supported the People's Party. Both white and, where they could vote, black voters supported the People's Party as well. A group also known as the Populist Party. And populist in the sense of representing what the common people wanted. In 1892, they nominated Civil War veteran General James Weaver to run for the presidency. And while he did not win, he got about 9% of the popular vote, 5% of the electoral vote, carrying 4 western states outright and picking up a couple other electoral votes elsewhere in the West. And over the course of the 1890s, the Populists would elect 10 state governors, 6 U.S. senators, 39 congressmen, and of course, state level and local officials as well. And they demanded reform through government action. Of course, they wanted free silver, and to freely meant all the silver that could be mined. They want a progressive income tax to tax the wealthy so the government would have the money it needed to support farmers. They wanted to change how senators were elected, because when the Constitution was written, how were senators chosen? Who picked the senators? It was state legislatures that picked the senators, and increasingly, farmers and some others felt state legislatures were too easily corrupted, and therefore they wanted direct election of senators. There'd be a statewide election, and all the people of a state could pick their own senators. They wanted the U.S. government to take over transportation routes. Just as county governments maintained and owned the roads, the U.S. government, they thought, should own the railroads and other transportation networks. Likewise, communication networks should be run by the government, essentially as utilities for the public good, not for private profit. And the Populists took votes from Republicans and Democrats in most parts of the country, but in the South, of course, the only people to take votes from were the Democrats. And so Southern Democrats were particularly worried about this threat to their overwhelming power, and so they went out of their way to play upon racism by pointing out that the Populist Party included the farmers' alliances, which in turn included both black members. They claimed a vote for the Populists was a vote for Negro supremacy. Even with the farm, and this weakened the Populists in the South, but in the North, Republicans, and the West, Republicans were weakened. Under President Benjamin Harrison, the Homestead Strike had taken place. High tariffs had not resulted in higher wages for factory workers. The billion-dollar Congress struck many people as wasteful. And so in the end, in the election of 1892, Grover Cleveland won, returning to the presidency, the only president thus far to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. But Grover Cleveland's second term would be much harder than his first. Not long after he was inaugurated, the Panic of 1893 hit. And Cleveland was a pretty conservative Democrat. He and many other conservatives believed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act had hurt the economy. The U.S. government had used up gold buying silver. They argued the inflation that it was meant to cause, although in fact it didn't cause much, had destabilized the economy too. And Cleveland convinced Congress to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893, which split his party, turning many farmers, especially Western farmers, against Cleveland. And it still wasn't enough to save the economy, as 2 years later, the U.S. government, under Cleveland, had to borrow $65 million in gold from J.P. Morgan. And so the government's immense spending and borrowing angered many unemployed Americans who didn't feel any of it was helping them. And some marched to Washington, D.C. itself to demand government action, wanted the government to print paper money and build roads. That would both improve the economy too by promoting trade and would create jobs for the unemployed. The most famous leader of one of these marches was Jacob Coxey, who himself was successful in business. He owned a sand quarry in Ohio, but he worried about the state of the economy as a whole, and in 1894 began marching to Washington with about 100 supporters. More and more people joined what came to be called Coxey's Army. At its peak, it had 6,000 men and women marching to Washington, D.C. to demand paper money and a public works program. Although by the time they actually got to Washington, many of those people had given up on the march. And when they reached the U.S. Capitol building, they were arrested for walking on the grass. Other groups tried similar marches. One group even hijacked a train to drive to Washington, although eventually U.S. Marshals managed to get on board the train and arrest them. Although for a time they even fought off the U.S. Marshals. So in Grover Cleveland's second term would leave him very unpopular. He had some foreign policy successes. He also survived an operation to remove a cancer from his mouth, so that part of his jaw afterwards was an artificial rubber jaw. All the operation was done in secret, so people wouldn't know that the president was out of commission for a time. But being pretty conservative, he alienated many more liberal members of his party. His opposition to the Silver Purchase Act angered many farmers and many miners. He angered the working class by breaking the Pullman Strike. And even though he did create a lower tariff than the McKinley Tariff, he did support a higher tariff than the average Democrat, angering Southerners and farmers in general. And he did get a lower tariff, but not as low as many Democrats wanted. So although he wanted to run for re-election in 1896, the Democrats weren't going to have that. They saw the Populists as a threat and decided to nominate someone pretty populist of their own. And turned to the very strongly pro-silver Western Congressman, 36-year-old representative from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was already a famous public speaker, nicknamed the Boy Orator of the Platte. Of course, the boy because he was so young at 36. An orator means a public speaker. The Platte River runs through his home state of Nebraska, although some people said he was too much like the Platte, which apparently is pretty shallow, but 6 miles wide at the mouth. But he said he spoke for farmers and for poor workers. He demanded free silver, using very religious imagery, at a time when most Americans were very religious. In his most famous speech, and in those days, once you had a good speech, you could give it over and over again because it couldn't be broadcast on the radio or television. In his most famous speech, he said, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The Republicans who supported the gold standard, he said, were like the Romans who crucified Christ. And he traveled the country giving this and other speeches. The first time a major presidential candidate had actively campaigned for himself. Up to this point, that was seen as undignified, as begging for votes. But Bryan didn't care. He slept just a few hours a night, traveled 18,000 miles in 3 months. It's believed he spoke to at least 5 million people at a time when there were only about 70 million people in the country. In other words, on average, 1 out of every 14 Americans heard William Jennings Bryan speak in person. And although free silver was not the populist only issue, it was one of their main ones. And they recognized Bryan as someone like themselves. He was known as the Great Commoner, among other things. And so the Populists also nominated William Jennings Bryan. So he was technically the presidential candidate of not one, but 2 political parties. Although I guess you did have the option of picking whether you preferred the Democratic or the Populist vice presidential candidate. And giving their support to Bryan would kind of be the beginning of the end for the Populist Party. Although, while he attracted the Populists, he lost the support of conservative Democrats known as the gold bugs. A gold bug being someone who continued to support the gold standard. The Grover Cleveland was a gold bug, so opposed to the bimetallic standard that these gold bugs actively opposed their own party, leading to a split within the Democrats that would help to guarantee Republicans controlled the White House for the next 16 years. Because the Republicans are going to win this thing, and they're going to win the way Republicans won. was a Civil War veteran from Ohio and a vice president from New York. William McKinley, and had been in the Civil War. He'd been to Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day of the war. And he was supported by a powerful Ohio businessman and political boss known as Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna once said, "There are two things that are important in politics. The first is money." I can't remember what the second one is. And plenty of gold bug Republicans spent money on his campaign. The Republicans outspent the Democrats 5-1 in this presidential campaign. That's some pretty clever gimmicks. They printed up fake paper dollar bills with William Jennings Bryan's portrait on them. They said, "In God we trust," for the other 53 cents, claiming that with free silver, the value of the dollar would be cut by more than half. We had to trust in God for the rest of it. And so with the Democrats split and the Republicans running a well-funded campaign, with William McKinley giving frequent speeches from the front porch of his house, but traveling no further than that, McKinley won the election. Again, pretty soon the Populist Party began to dissolve, having already thrown its support to the Democrats. Although things did begin to get a little bit better for American farmers. There were in the late 1890s a series of crop failures in Europe. Bad news for Europeans, but good news for American farmers who could sell their food in Europe as farm prices rose due to the famines in Europe. Furthermore, just after McKinley was elected, or perhaps during the campaign, gold was discovered. There had been a limited supply of gold for decades, but now almost simultaneously, gold was discovered in Alaska and Canada and Australia and South Africa, prompting gold rushes to all of those regions and bringing enough gold into the economy to create a moderate, manageable level of inflation, maybe not quite as good as free silver, but good enough for most Americans. So, while William Jennings Bryan would run again for the presidency in 1900, and free silver would be part of his platform, he would have to take up some other causes too, and would once again be unsuccessful. Still, even if the Populists did not bring about many of the reforms they had hoped to create, a number of the causes they stood for would be taken up in the 1890s and especially the early 20th century by middle-class urban reformers who would push the government to change in many ways.